You're listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network, and now it's time for the Paranormal Peep Show.
Hi, welcome to the Paranormal Peep Show on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm Neil Geddes-Ward, and once more I'm joined by Andy Chaplin. A welcome return to Andy. We haven't seen for a while. Andy, what have you been up to, and where have you been, and how are you?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. I've been a busy bunny, basically. So the events have really picked up. There's a lot of... my life is basically whizzing around pubs, putting banners and signs up and delivering posters, and then dealing with event changes and things like that. So, yeah, all over the place.
So you've been throwing curveballs in your professional life?
Yeah, so I mean, there's this old thing, isn't there, about cancelled due to unforeseen circumstances within the psychic world. And there's one of my venues down south, actually, that is no longer going ahead because there's a dispute between the brewery and a company. But what we've done, we found a different venue up the road, which they're going to now take over and do it. So that's good. But it just means a lot of racing around last minute and sorting things out. So, yeah, a lot of fun.
Wow. Okay, so your evenings are a lot busier now because you're focusing a lot more on your tuned-in events for anyone that's interested.
Yeah, it's good. It's definitely getting, and we're always looking for new venues, and we're changing our format a little bit. So we started off, first of all, just doing psychic one-to-one readings, and then we moved on to doing psychic one-to-one readings and group mediumship demonstrations. We're now doing all of that plus ghost stories because some of our clairvoyants are actually paranormal investigators, and they've done ghost hunts and things like that. And they've had a lot of weird supernatural experiences. And we thought it'd be a fantastic idea to let people at the pubs that come to our events experience some of the stories that they've encountered, including down my hometown in Ware. There's one particular venue where a skeleton man has been seen poking behind the doors. And we did a Dickensian evening, probably around about in December time, where we did kind of psychic stories and psychic demos and stuff. And one of our readers actually saw the skeleton man pop his head round the door, like literally as we were dressed up as psychic Victorians. Thing. And he's literally kind of like a very pale, very kind of like gaunt looking, almost skeleton type man, just poked his head round and then disappeared. And they heard kind of whispering and talking in the corners. So... yeah, it's bizarre, really bizarre. And I swear, Spirit is ramping things up for us to give us ammunition, so to speak, or stories for our events. Because another one of our psychics saw, travelling back from a venue in Letchworth to, I think it was St Albans, but they went kind of down a place called Hitchin Road, and they saw a spirit walk across the road, the spirit of a man. And the next day they found a grave in the field, just like a single lone grave in the field of where this actually took place.
Wow.
And they only found that out the day after. So very interesting. If anyone does want to kind of look into this kind of thing or has any venue suggestions in south of England, go to Tuned In Events, tuned with a D, Tuned In Events. Find us on Facebook, Instagram. Website still being updated, but Facebook definitely.
Is that .co.uk?
Yeah, tunedinevents.co.uk or on Facebook, Tuned In Events. There's a group and a page and messages through that.
Okay, so basically for those that don't know about it, obviously we talk quite regularly about this thing that you do. It's basically psychic evenings.
Yeah.
People coming along for psychic demonstrations, psychic readings, and now you're adapting to actually for people to relate stories and things like that.
Yeah, this is it. So there's we do one-to-one readings, which is a separate thing, and then we do group demonstrations, psychic demonstrations, plus ghost stories, and that's another separate thing. But they both happen on the same evening.
Wow, that sounds a good thing to go to. So for anyone you're in the Hertfordshire area, but you're branching out now. So
yeah, we're looking into we do mostly Hertfordshire, Essex, North London, Buckinghamshire, Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire. but we are branching out a little bit into Kent and kind of East Sussex and Hampshire area as well.
Right. So if you're any of those counties and you fancy taking part in one of Andy's tuned-in events, go to tunedinevents.co.uk to find out further information. I suppose you have a posting listings of where you're appearing and things like that.
Yeah, as I say, the website's being updated, so it's better to go onto Facebook. So go onto Facebook
all the latest up
for all the latest ones and find our group or page.
Cool. Excellent. Well, I wonder if they have anything like tuned-in events up in the north of England, because you seem to be covering the south quite well.
Yeah, we don't really touch the north.
Yeah, so we might as well bring our guest in. Maybe you can tell us if there's anything similar to that up north. So I'd like to welcome Craig Bryant of the Paranormal Radio, UK Radio's other show, which is the Paranormal Pendle Podcast. Welcome to Craig Bryant up in Lancashire in the north of England. How are you, Craig?
Great. Thank you very much for having me on. Wonderful to talk to you.
Hi,
Thank you for joining us. And in answer to Andy's question, do you have anything like tuned-in events up north that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of, I'm afraid to say, no. Maybe you need to branch out a little bit further north.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, maybe that's where Craig can, start his own version of it.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, that's right. It'd be, what do they call it when you buy a thing in company and you go off on your own? Franchise. There you go. You've got to start franchises, Andy. So there we go. Cool. Well, thank you for joining us, Craig. So as I mentioned, you are a member of the Paranormal UK Radio Network as well. You're a host yourself now, and you've been having your show. How long have you been running your show on the Paranormal UK Radio Network?
Probably for about 2 years.
It is. Wow.
Yeah. I'm not as prolific as some. I tend to sort of do a show every sort of 2 to 3 weeks, really. I think I'm up to about, I've just recorded episode 37. So yeah, a couple of years.
Wow. And I mean, we've been doing ours for since 2016 or 17, I think, Andy, haven't we? We do ours once a month mostly.
Yeah.
So once a month is hard enough to get a show out, really. I don't know how these people do it once a week, like Mark and Irene and other people, but I'm just Andy's very busy. I'm so busy. So we just kind of managed to cram it in a little bit somewhere within our busy month. We try and cram in at least a recording to get out to the people. So what prompted you to start doing a Paranormal Pendle podcast?
Well, it really sort of stemmed from the fact that I wrote a book, which was something that I've been meaning to do for a long time. And about 3 years ago, I actually sat down and put virtual pen to virtual paper, in other words, keyboard to screen, and wrote a book. And it was basically a book which is about my own personal experiences, experiences of family, friends, and people that I spoke to when I was researching the book. Very much based around the area that I grew up in, which is East Lancashire. So town of Accrington is a sort of centre. And once I had published that on Amazon, I then sort of sat there and thought, right, what do I do next? Do I write another book, or do I try something different? And the idea of doing a podcast, which was something that I hadn't really thought about in the past, just suddenly popped into my mind, because I'd been a guest on a number of podcasts up to this point, obviously talking about the book, and being quite new to the whole scene. Really, I was in quite a bit of demand, it seemed, at the time. I was doing quite a lot of interviews for various different podcasts, and I just thought, you know what, I'm going to give it a go. I'll have a go. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And I've enjoyed doing it. I mean, it can be a little bit stressful trying to get guests and fit it all in. As you say, I've got a full-time job. I'm married. I'm a father. In fact, I've just had a very interesting conversation with a very stressed-out 16-year-old who's going through his GCSEs.
Oh, crikey.
So of course, life does get in the way of doing all these sort of things. But I've spoken to some really interesting guests over the last couple of years. I've had some really high-profile guests on there. I've spoken to people about some fascinating subjects, some really interesting stories, some really interesting points of view. And it's just been a real pleasure to talk to I would say probably 95% of the people I've had on the show, have been really, really good. And I've really enjoyed speaking to them,
Are you allowed to name drop and say who you've had on?
Well, yeah. I was very lucky to get Paul Sinclair on quite early on. Paul reciprocated and had me on his live stream. I've been on there a couple of times now. I've had Philip Mantle. I've had a local guy called Simon Entwistle, who is
he has the stories, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. He's a local guide, local paranormal guide from Clitheroe, which is the nearest town to where I live. It's a couple of miles down the road. So he was actually the first guest that I had on. So yeah, I've had both of the both Philip and Ronald Kinsella on there.
Good friends of ours, yeah.
They're cool.
I actually had them on separate, one after the other. So rather than have them both on at the same time, which was quite interesting. Different points of view.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I've had some really interesting people on there.
You learn a lot actually, because it's amazing when people bring their subject to the table and they start to divulge things and just say off the cuff things that you think, wow, that's a bit of a gem of a story that you've just told me there. And within the 2 years that you've been running, you've probably accumulated so much information that you perhaps wouldn't have otherwise come across.
No, and I mean, a good example of that. The last podcast that I did was with a chap called Dave Hodrian.
Dave, I know Dave well. Yeah,
oh, Dave. Yeah,
well, UFO group. Yeah,
that's the one. So it was one of those podcasts that just went off, and it just went off in a direction that I didn't expect it to go. And he started telling me about various different UFO abduction cases, and I thought as I was sat here, it was going dark outside, and I was getting more and more, because it was audio only.
Yeah.
But I was sort of getting more and more like this as he was telling me. I was getting actually quite scared when he was telling me. I was there were noises and things going on all around me and outside and what have you. And yeah, great storytelling. Really, set the scene really well. Really atmospheric. Episode. Really thought provoking as well. And a little bit disturbing. And I think sometimes it's great to go down that route. You can have the sort of ghost stories which I've had, which are they can be a little more titillating sometimes, rather than being downright a little bit scary. Yeah, I was thinking of scary or worrying or a bit disturbing and unnerving. Yeah. So yeah, that was a really interesting hour and a half, I must admit.
Yeah, it's like being taken into the Twilight Zone with a lot of this stuff. For any people that remember the Twilight Zone, I mean, they did repeats of it actually back in the 80s, I think, on TV. I think you can catch episodes of the Twilight Zone for anyone that likes that kind of stuff on YouTube. There's some great stuff on YouTube, old films, science fiction films I've watched sometimes, sometimes better than Netflix, because there's something kind of nice about the time that they were made, some of these old science fiction films, and they're just kind of, I know, they seem kind of weirdly, strangely comforting, even though the special effects aren't that great. There's something comforting about them. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's nostalgic stuff. I don't know.
Yeah, they're sort of quite simple, aren't they?
Yeah. But it's what we kind of grew up on, that sort of stuff, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I used to like Strange But True, a slightly different thing, but
that's a Michael Aspel show, isn't it?
Yeah, I used to love that.
Yeah.
I grew up watching UFO, Space 1999.
Yeah.
Tales of the Unexpected as well. Yeah. There were several episodes of those that still resonate with me today as being quite disturbing. So
talking of disturbing, Craig, can you rattle through a timeline of events of things that you've experienced and supernatural were in your life?
Yeah, where did it all begin?
Well, yeah, it began an awful long time ago. I have been interested in the paranormal really ever since I was a small child. I spent a lot of time with my maternal grandparents, and my grandfather was was a really good storyteller, and he had an interest in ghost stories and local legends and all those sort of weird, strange stories. And looking back on it now, for him to be, you know, recounting these stories to a 6, 7, 8-year-old child was probably a little bit scary. But I actually loved listening to these stories that he used to tell me, and it was really those times that sort of started my interest in the paranormal. And then as I got older and got into my teens, these things sort of leave you a little bit, and you have different interests in life and different priorities in life and so on. But then in the mid-80s, I was, when I was at college, I was working part-time in, it was a very old sort of members club, with, you know, a bar and a big room with snooker tables in it. It was an old conservative club in Accrington. Now, unfortunately, the building isn't there anymore. It succumbed to arson about 10 years ago now, I think, something like that. But when I worked there, it was still very much in its original grandeur as a building, and it was a really, really interesting place just to be in there. But I actually had quite an interesting experience with what people now call a shadow man or a hat man. It was, at the time, it wasn't a phrase that was particularly well known. I mean, you know, obviously back in the mid-80s, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have the exposure that these sort of things have now. And we certainly didn't have the radio shows and the podcasts and that sort of thing. So this sort of this description has been sort of attached to this type of phenomenon since. But at the time, I thought I'd just seen a ghost or some sort of ghostly apparition. And it was actually whilst I was in the club, I was working in the club one night, and I actually saw this figure through. It was sort of like I was working behind one of the bars. And in the room next door, the adjacent room, it was quite a large room, and it was where they had all the snooker tables. So there was 3 full-size 12-foot by 6-foot snooker tables in there. So you can imagine it was quite a big room. And there was a sort of waist-high serving hatch at the end of the bar. It was only about probably, I don't know, maybe 2 meters square, something like that. 2 meters by 2 meters. It wasn't a particularly big opening, and obviously people who were playing snooker, they used to come to, and that was the part of the bar they used to come to in that room, and you serve them drinks, what have you. But there was nobody in the bar this particular evening. We were about to close up. It was only about half an hour before we were due to close. I mean, this is back in the day where you used to close bars used to close at 10 o'clock or 10:30, whatever, during the week, and there was nobody in the snooker room. It was completely empty. There was nobody in the bar area, and I saw this figure through the serving hatch, stood at the other side of the serving hatch in the snooker room, in that area of the building, and it was sort of very tall, very thin. I could remember seeing that it was wearing what looked like a hat, a sort of fedora type hat. It wasn't like a top hat or a stovepipe hat,
like a Dick Tracy type hat.
Yeah, that sort of thing. Yeah. So it wasn't like a Victorian stovepipe hat or anything like that, as you used to call them. Stovepipe hats. You used to call them the long, Isambard Kingdom Brunel type thing. It was more a sort of floppy type hat in a way. And yeah, this figure, although there was no facial features, it was just a very dark outline and a very dark shape. I could see that it had arms. I could see that it had a torso, because I could only see it from the waist up because of where the bar was. But it was leaning forward, and it was almost like it was leaning through the hatch and looking through on the other, on my side of the hatch, and looking down at the floor with its arms on either side. And this stayed there for a few seconds, probably about 4 or 5 seconds, and then it just disappeared completely. And we had
Could you see? Sorry, could you see through it, or was it? Oh, could you make out details? Or
no, it was solid. It was a solid dark shape, so I couldn't see through it. It wasn't translucent or anything like that. But there were no facial features. There were no features of clothing. It was just a defined black mass, and in the shape of a figure with this hat. And as I said, this was the mid-80s, so we didn't have mobile phones or anything like that. But we did have an internal phone system because the building was actually on 3 floors and a cellar. And the only other person that I knew that was in the building at the time was the guy who used to run the club. He was a steward, and he was upstairs on the 3rd floor. So I rang up using the internal phone system, and I said, "Can you come downstairs? Something really weird's just happened." So he said, "Yeah, I'll worse that effect. I'll keep it clean." And anyway, about 30 seconds later, he came through the door, and he just looked at me and he said, "Blimey," he said, "Are you all right?" He said, "You look like you've seen a ghost." And I said, strangely enough, I think I've done. And he said, "Oh," he said, "What? You've seen it as well, have you?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, he said, "I've seen it, and it's been seen by quite a few other people over the years who've worked here, many of whom have seen it and left and never come back." And he described it perfectly, and he also described exactly where I'd seen it. So he said, through the serving hatch in the snooker room on the other side, long, tall, thin figure sort of thing. And I said, "Yeah, that's the one." And yeah, that was it. I don't think it really scared me at the time. I was more curious,
as intrigued by it.
Intrigued, yeah, and sort of a little bit perplexed. I think is probably the best way. And I didn't really sort of mention it to anybody else because it just didn't. I didn't want people to think I was going a bit doolally, even though what I'd seen had been corroborated. It's not something that I wanted to talk about. But over the years, I've spoken to people, friends who worked in the club over the years, and associates and what have you, and they allude to seeing something strange, or they allude to hearing that somebody had seen something strange. So it's definitely quite a prolific sighting.
Have they worked out who it might be? Like if there's any murders or suicides or anything tragedy that happened?
Well, interestingly, for a long time, no. But then when I was doing some research for the second book that I wrote, there's a street very close by to where the club was called Warner Street. And Warner Street is probably the people who do a lot of paranormal investigations in the Northwest, reckon it's probably one of the most haunted streets that they investigate. And there is one particular premises that's had quite a lot of investigation done into it. Now, I interviewed a local medium a couple of years ago, actually. It was one of the early podcast interviews that I did. And she mentioned a entity that they had picked up on called Josiah. And he was described as being a very tall, thin man with a hat. Now, they'd had this experience, and in fact, it was quite a violent entity. I think is the best way to describe it. It was very, very classic poltergeist activity. There was a lot of movement of things, a lot of things being thrown, and there was a lot of physical shoving and pushing. And Diane, who's the medium that I spoke to, her husband was actually physically pushed down the stairs by this person.
And they picked this up at this venue, you're saying?
They did. It wasn't the same venue where I saw it, where I saw the figure, but it was literally within about a quarter of a mile.
Right.
But the interesting thing about because the description was too similar for me, and I wonder whether this particular entity is moving about. Now, the reason why I'm saying that is because when I did some I actually started to do a bit of research online into, because you mentioned a murder. So when I started doing some research into this particular murder, it was a lady called Anne Coates who'd been murdered. And there was, the murder was, this was back in the late 19th century. It's all in the second book, the whole story. But briefly what had happened was, a young boy had been charged with the murder because he'd found the body, but she was still alive actually when he found her. She died later on from her wounds. She'd been stabbed, and it was only at the trial, which was at Lancaster Castle, that an anonymous letter was received from somebody who, a number of days later, after the murder had taken place, had been talking to what he described as a very tall, very thin, very gaunt-looking man in a public house in Bolton. Now, people who don't know the area, Bolton is probably about, I would say it's about 20 miles from Accrington, 20, 25 miles. But back in those days, before we had major roads and motorways, it will probably take you a good half a day to get there by horse and cart or whatever. This was obviously before the days of motor cars. And this particular gentleman, this very tall, thin, gaunt gentleman, had confessed. He was drunk in this pub, and he confessed to this anonymous letter writer that he had murdered Anne Coates in Accrington a few days earlier. And the next day, they actually found his body dead on the railway lines in the centre of Bolton. So it would seem that the same man, the man who had committed the murder, and obviously fled the scene, got as far away as he possibly could, had confessed something had happened, and he'd ended up being found dead on the railway lines. But then, of course, his spirit has come back, and he's haunting the premises where, as it turns out, this murder had taken place. But I'm pretty convinced that it's the same spirit that is moving around, because it has been seen, or there's been sightings of a tall, thin, shadowy figure in the area in general, in the sort of, half a mile square area around where the old club was, and this particular shop and Warner Street. So it's possible they are the same. I can't prove it, but I think the description and everything else would seem to be too much of a coincidence to my opinion.
So it could be that he's frequenting like where he used to hang out at.
Yeah, the area.
It'll be interesting. Do the venues that this particular entity has been seen, do they all report the same thing in terms of violent activity or poltergeist activity? That would be interesting.
Well, the with regards to the because it's a shop on Warner Street, so with regards to the shop, then yes, there is quite a lot of poltergeist activity, and in fact it was heightened when somebody decided to go in and foolishly use a Ouija board.
That it.
Yeah, and it made things an awful lot worse. With regards to the club where I used to work, as I say, unfortunately, about 10 years ago, it burned down, and there's nothing there at the minute. It's just basically a pile of rubble. People have been trying to get planning permission to build on the site. Now, that would be interesting if somebody does build something on the site, to see whether there is any poltergeist activity that comes forward from that, because I've no doubt that whatever the spirit is, whatever the entity is probably still in that area.
It's interesting. There's 2 points I'd like to say about that. One is that Borley Rectory, famous, the most haunted house in Britain, allegedly burned down. That's how it ended in the 1930s. And so, your conservative club burnt down as well. Now, someone obviously started a fire at Borley Rectory, someone obviously started a fire at the conservative club. Who they were, we don't know. But it's interesting that these places with ghosts end up getting burnt down to the ground. And I wonder, just speculatively, that, there was a medium in the town of Chesham where I lived, and he was a very, very good medium. Years ago, he gave me a reading in a spiritualist church, but a lot of people, not knowing much about spiritualism or mediums, kind of thought that he was a kind of a witch type bloke. And he suffered a fire in his own house where people had literally thrown fire bombs at his house or something like that, after he had died.
Wow.
And so they literally tried to burn down his house. He was a really nice guy and everything. Just he happened to be a really talented, accurate medium. But it's, again, the people that don't understand these things, it's mob mentality, and fire rules the game, and they'll try and burn it down. Yeah. So I wonder if your conservative club, the word's got round that there's something nasty there and they're trying to destroy it,
Yeah, entirely possible. I mean, it was empty for quite a while. He did actually close as a club, and it became a nightclub for a short period of time. And then there was, unfortunately, a fatality outside the nightclub, and they lost the license to trade. And then it was empty for quite a while, and it fell into quite serious disrepair. And I have photographs of somebody had managed to get inside and take photographs of it in its state of disrepair. So that was a bit upsetting, really, to see that, because it was quite a magnificent building inside.
How old was the building, roughly?
1896, I think it was built.
Would it have been a listed building, perhaps?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. It was. You see, that's what one of the problems with it was, because it was a Grade 2 listed building. People who wanted to take it over and do things with it couldn't get planning permission.
Yeah.
So it just laid empty, and just fell into a state of disrepair.
Yeah, it's interesting, actually, because, I mean, years and years ago, there was a pub in Chesham called I think it's still there, the Dragon, or something, the Dragon, I forget what it was, something, the Dragon, that we used to do plays in there years ago, and in the upstairs bar, someone had found old drawings that someone had done on the wall from literally the time of the 18 or 1700s, like you'd call them cartoons, but they weren't. Yeah. They were literally drawings, quite accurate drawings. People with like the Dick Turpin hats, and they'd drawn them on the wall from their time of, And the new the guy who took over the pub some years later, was saying, "Oh, it's a shame. I really want to paper over that and put stuff up there, but I'm not allowed to." It's like, God, don't you appreciate history? These things had actually been framed and got glass over them to protect them because they were a listed thing, And I think when they discovered it was all in the papers. Wow, look at these historical drawings. This is history stuff. And this guy just wanted to take up the whole lot and just paper it over, not giving a shit. As long as he made a load of money, he was quite happy to do that. And it's quite annoying that these people want to do that. So you can see why that they're. It's a very difficult thing when people want to take over a listed building about what they can and can't do with it.
That's right. Yeah.
But I guess there could be a thing there somewhere that someone says, "Oh, if we firebomb the place, that gets rid of the property. Then we've got the actual land that we can then build on, all the fresh and all nice to what we want." You could see it like that as well. Now it's interesting. You said you saw this guy with the hat on coming through the doorway of the serving hatch. Now, in a lot of my research, and you might have heard people say it yourself talking to people, that ghosts and spirits, they often cite people standing in doorways or looking through windows and things like that. And in my research, it seems to come up a hell of a lot. And it seems to me that it's no coincidence that when mediums, physical mediums, they use what they call a seance cabinet or a medium's cabinet, which is a bit like a wardrobe, if you like, or a curtain or something, where they're sit in a kind of framework-like structure, and if the conditions are right, ectoplasmic forms coming out of the medium will form into some sort of structure of a human being and come out there, pull the curtain of this cabinet or open the door or whatever it may be and step out. It's normally a curtain. But they're forming in a kind of square box-like structure. And I did ask a medium this because he had one in his own bedroom. And I said, "Why do you have this cabinet? What's the idea of it?" He said, "Well, you sit inside it. And it has got to be a box-like structure because it builds up the energy." And so as an analogy, I say to people that if they want to make a cake, for instance, they might put the mixture in a tin and they switch their oven on and they open the oven door and they pop in their cake tin with the mixture and they shut it. and they've got to have the door shut because it builds up the energy, the heat energy in this case. And after a time, the structure of the liquid stuff becomes like a sponge cake or something. And so, in a sense, it's like the structure of this stuff, what the meat is produced, the ectoplasm, will become a solid mass once you've built up the energy, and henceforth they open up the curtain and step out. And I think that they can make similar structures, albeit on a more temporary basis, using things like serving hatches or doorways. They can appear in doorways momentarily, maybe 5 or 6 seconds, and then they're gone. And it's a way of bouncing the energy, I think, between the beams or the structure of the panels and things like that. And there's an interesting thing that they have in Chinese or Japanese folklore is when they build bridges over rivers, they have a bridge and they'll have it go somewhere, but then it'll turn right and then it'll turn left. It won't be a straightforward bridge over a river. In the olden times, they'd have a bridge that goes left, right, left, right, left, right. And the idea was that it was to keep spirits at bay, because spirits, or evil spirits, so they said, could not navigate across this bridge. It makes me wonder if there's a similar kind of idea going there with the structure of the bridge. So it's worth looking into. It'd be interesting that should someone build on the premises of the Conservative Club, that when they start to build things, that they might still get more ghost sightings, even though it'll be a modern building, simply because whatever could be there might utilize the same structure of doorways or hatches or things like that just to manifest in, especially if they're stuck there, you see. So it's one of those things that's worth keeping an eye on, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So your books, what prompted you to write the books? Obviously, you started to accumulate a lot of stories and presumably wanted to commit them to paper in some form.
Well, yeah. That the story that I've just told you really was the first one, because that was the thing that had stuck with me for quite a while. But I started talking to family and friends, and I literally just started to collect these stories, and I knew that there were stories that had never been put in print before, because a lot of them were very personal stories. My wife's family, for instance, lived in a very old farmhouse which had some really interesting poltergeist activity in it. And I just started to collect all these stories, and eventually I had enough to put into a book. I put some feelers out on local social media pages for the sort of East Lancashire area to see if anybody would contact me with their own personal stories, and I got lots and lots of people were more than happy to talk to me about their own experiences. Some of them were quite eye opening. One particular lady I spoke to about a house she lived in, where again there was massive amounts of poltergeist activity, some of it quite violent. She did research into the property and came up with some really quite fascinating facts and theories about what was causing these manifestations. As I say, my wife's family had some really interesting experiences when they lived at the farm, and so yeah, it was just I got so many stories that I thought, well, it would be such a shame not to actually put them into a book. And again, very much like starting a podcast these days, it's if you have the time and the energy to write a book, you can self-publish, as we know. You don't have to find a publisher anymore. You don't have to find an agent. You can literally do it yourself, and that's what a lot of people do. And so it's actually quite easy if you have the material. It's actually quite easy to write and publish a book these days. So I thought, well, I might as well do it because I've got so many great stories. It just seemed a shame not to commit them to posterity.
And so that was the first book, The Ghosts of Accrington. Would that be right?
The first one's called The Shadow Man of Accrington.
Shadow Man. Sorry, big one. The Shadow Man of Accrington.
And obviously that's the titular story of the book, the one that I had. And then the second book, which is a sort of follow up to that, which again has got lots of personal experiences in there, lots of local legends, lots of little bits and pieces from people who've contacted me over the years who've either read the first book or listened to the podcast and contacted me again with their own stories, basically from the same, from the area of East Lancashire, and also up now where I live near Pendle Hill. Some really interesting ghost stories from this area as well.
Am I right in saying the witches of Pendle Hill? Is that the story there?
Yeah, there's the Pendle Witches, which was it's a very famous trial, the Pendle Witch Trial from 1612. So yeah, that the people who were involved in that all lived around here in this area. It was all based in this area. So I do go into that a little bit in both books. Talk a little bit about that because obviously it's quite an emotive subject, and a lot of people find it very interesting, and there's a lot of history of that around here where I live. And I'm very lucky. I look out my office window where I'm talking to you now, and I can see Pendle Hill from the window. So I'm literally sort of a quarter of a mile away from the hill itself. So,
for the benefit of listeners who've never heard of it, do you want to give a brief synopsis of the witches of Pendle Hill?
Yeah, well, it happened back in 1612. It was basically it involved two local families, really, two very poor local families, and a few other individuals who got roped into it. There was about 12 people altogether were tried at Lancaster. And basically it was a product of the times. James the James VI of Scotland, James I of England had just come to the throne following the death of Elizabeth I. He was obsessed with witchcraft. He wrote a book called Demonology, which instructed his followers how to deal with witches. So all the things about dunking witches in water, and how to interrogate them, how to use things like bodkins and that sort of thing to get to get confessions out of them, were to look on the bodies for the marks that they believed that the devil made when the devil was they believed that the devil would suck the blood of these people in return for favours. And basically what happened with these two families, there were two matriarchs of both families, Chattocks on one side and Demdike on the other, as they were known locally. And they basically got caught up in an investigation by a local magistrate. And James I had basically sent an instruction out to all the magistrates across the country to be on the lookout for people who they thought were involved in witchcraft. Now, these may well have just been people who didn't attend church, believe it or not. In fact, they used to go around to the churches on a Sunday, and they used to see who was in church, so they used to see who wasn't in church. And the ones that weren't in church, they used to question and interrogate. What happened with these two families were that there were a number of accusations made by each family towards the other family. So there were things such as harming livestock, so turning milk sour, causing people to have illnesses, even in some cases causing death. One particular gentleman who was a local merchant had suffered. Well, he was called John Law, and he was on his way to Halifax when he met one of the old women and her daughter, her granddaughter, by the side of the road. They were begging, and because he wouldn't buy any of the goods that they were trying to sell, or basically give them any money, one of them, it was probably just a throwaway comment, said something along the lines of "I curse you" or something like that. And he literally at that point had a stroke and fell off his horse. Now, of course, they put this down to witchcraft. The local magistrate got involved. He started to interrogate various members of the two families and various other people as well who were associates. So probably one of the most famous ones is a lady by the name of Alice Nutter. Yeah, that's probably where the phrase comes from. She was quite a well-to-do widow of a local yeoman farmer who had quite a bit of land actually, and she was implicated in various different acts of witchcraft as well. Interestingly, when you start to look into what was actually going on, a lot of these people were actually practicing Catholics, and they used to practice in secret. And so, of course, it was quite easy for people to accuse them of, well, if whatever you're doing in secret, it's obviously, unholy and you're in league with the devil and everything else. And there were a number of quite wild confessions as well. Some of these people genuinely believed that they were in league with the devil and that they could cast spells, they could heal people. They were very much sort of local wise women, as you call them now. They were very poorly educated. They believed a lot of what they were saying. There was a lot of accusations towards other people. So there were various accusations flying around. I mean, one of them was that Chattocks used to go to graveyards and dig up dead bodies. And they also used to, they were involved in infanticide and all sorts of stuff. So basically, they were all carted off up to Lancaster, which is about a 70-mile walk. There is actually the Pendle Witch Way, as it's called, which is basically following the route from Clitheroe to Lancaster, up over the moors, through the Forest of Bowland. The route that they took, they marched them up there to Lancaster Castle. They tried them, put them on trial. The main witness for the prosecution was an 8-year-old girl who basically, Jeanette Preston, Jeanette Device. Jeanette Preston was one of the accused. Jeanette Device, who was, as I said, an 8-year-old girl. She basically came out with all sort of wild accusations against her own family. So her brother, her mother, her grandmother, and so on. She said that various stories about them being in league with the devil, and the devil would come to them in various forms. They had familiars, things like black cats, for instance. So that's where the black cat thing comes from. And they used to make potions and spells and all sorts of stuff. And she was the main prosecution witness. And off the back of all this, they were basically convicted of witchcraft and summarily hanged, executed.
All of them?
All apart from one who actually died in the cells at Lancaster Castle. Before the trial, they were held in pretty disgusting conditions for about 3 months, really, in dungeons prior to the trial. So they were in a fairly sorry old state by the time they did actually get to trial. But yeah, one of them didn't manage to get to trial. She died before the trial took place.
And how did they execute them? Was it hanging?
Yeah,
hanged on. Yeah, I think there's different laws. If you're in Scotland, you burn at the stake, or if you're in England, you hang or something.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure about being burned at the stake in Scotland. In England, no convicted witch, in inverted commas, was ever burnt in England.
Yeah.
They were all hanged, and in fact, torture wasn't allowed to extract confessions in England. It was in Scotland. So if you look at the Berwick witch trials, for instance, which was the witch trial really that started it all off with James I, he became quite obsessed with this witch trial. There were quite a lot of people involved in that, and there's some quite horrific accounts of how they extracted confessions from these people, and they were executed. I think they were hanged as well. I don't think they were burnt. They used to burn witches on the continent in Europe.
Maybe that's why I'm getting confused.
Yeah, and of course we used, there was a lot of religious burnings, shall we say? Depending on which monarch was sitting on the throne at the time, and certainly, Henry VIII and Mary, Bloody Mary, and Elizabeth were all pretty. I'm married to a history teacher, by the way, so yeah, they were all fairly adept at dispatching people by various different unpleasant methods.
Yeah, there was a very
burning was the main one. Yeah,
very, very unpleasant method they used in Scotland, which I actually visited the site of. I mean, I wasn't looking for it, I just happened to come across it many, many years ago. I stayed at the Findhorn Foundation, which is north of Inverness by about 30 miles. And next to the Findhorn Foundation, which is it's kind of a spiritual New Age centre where they supposedly had communication with the Diva Kingdom or Fairy Kingdom to grow huge vegetables back in the 60s. And it grew into the Findhorn Foundation that it is today. Well, when I was visiting that, there's a nearby town or village of Forest, and it's a really nice little pretty place with all the flowers and stuff like that. But there's this stone with an inscription on it. It's literally right outside the police station. And there's a hill with trees sort of like a mile and a half away, huge hill with trees. And it says this stone marks the place where this local witch, was put in a barrel full of spikes on the inside, and they rolled her down this hill, literally all the way down this hill. All these spikes were stabbing into a poor lady. Yeah. And eventually the barrel came to rest where this stone was, and it happened to be where they put the police station. Whether there was an intentional thing of putting the police station there, I don't know. But this stone with an inscription marked the spot. So I thought, God, these people were really nice to each other back in the Middle Ages. So they really had a way of, treating people fairly and with dignity. And
yeah. I mean, hanging probably was one of the better ways to go. Although
the quickest way of dispatching someone.
Well, yeah, but I mean, it wasn't hanging. They didn't drop them to break the neck.
Put them up on a road.
They used to, be on a cart, and they'd just and they'd just hang and dangle, and it could take quite a while, yeah. But I mean, there was some pretty unpleasant, ways.
Yeah, I mean, I was telling my partner last night about a case. It was only because we saw this little pig on Netflix, and she likes little pigs, and I said, "Did you know that they actually tried a pig in Germany in the Middle Ages for witchcraft?" Yeah. This pig was accused of being a witch, and they actually put the pig in the courtroom in Germany. And I don't know what the conclusion, whether they burnt it at a stake. I mean, it must have been like
had a nice barbecue.
Wow. A nice summer barbecue with pork scratchings and stuff like that afterwards.
Yeah, not very pleasant.
And it's the people that sometimes have the moral high ground, telling me that I'm in league with the devil when I do my events. There's a pub I can't go to now because the local Christians have basically said that it's all witchcraft and devil worshipping and all that kind of thing, and they don't want it done at the pub. These are the people.
They've obviously been in there to witness these things, of course, because they know much more than you do about what you actually do.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I just love the hypocrisy of it, of people who used to hang innocent people by the neck or burn them at the stake because they thought they had the moral high ground.
But that's okay, because they do apologise later on. A few popes later, the Pope kind of gives an apology, and it's all forgotten about, and we can all get on with our lives. But then they can still come out and accuse you of all sorts of nasty things. As long as they apologise for it, then they've got the moral high ground, you see. So they confess their sins. Anyway, I think we'll draw this first part of the Paranormal Peep Show to the end. We'll return in part 2. We're talking to Craig Bryant of the Paranormal Pendle Podcast. It's turned out to be very interesting, and we're not just chatting about ghosties, we're talking about witches and pigs as witches as well. So where will part 2 go, I wonder? So thanks very much for the moment, Craig. Join us in part 2 on the Paranormal Peep Show, not the Paranormal Pendle Podcast, on the Paranormal Peep Show. On the Paranormal Peep Show, minus the pigs, in part 2 on the Paranormal UK Radio Network.
Brilliant.
Today's the best day of my life! Woohoo! Listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network.
Join Andy and Neil every month on the Paranormal Peep Show, part of the Paranormal UK Radio Network, for fun, frolics and lots of information about weird stuff, UFOs, ghosts and things that go bump in the night and everything associated with them. Fascinating guests, fascinating talk, fascinating information.
Hi folks, you're listening to the Paranormal Peep Show on the Paranormal UK Radio Network with myself, Neil Geddes-Ward, and Craig from, is it Pendle? What's the radio show again?
Paranormal Pendle Podcast.
Paranormal Pendle Podcast, PPPs.
Yeah, it's a mouthful, isn't it?
It is. It's fun to it.
Did you have trouble coming up with a name? Or did it seem just think, call it Pendle Podcast?
No, it just seemed the obvious name for it, really, to be honest, considering where I live, what influenced my decision to do it, and it just PPP. It just seemed to roll off the tongue.
Right. Well, Andy came up with the Paranormal Peep Show, and so we kept that, and then we discovered, I think it was last year, actually, late in the summer last year, someone else had started another Paranormal Peep Show in America. So they had about 6 episodes out before we found out about it. So we went and knocked on their door nicely. I think they've had to change their name now or something. I haven't followed it through, so I don't know quite what's happened to that. But
so yeah. Craig, we've done witches and we've done ghosty woasties. Maybe we could move on to UFOs and ETs.
Okay.
What's your take on the whole UFO field and stuff?
Well, yeah, they definitely exist. Whether some of them are terrestrial is another matter. That obviously is the big question. Where they are coming from, whether they are from a different dimension, whether they are, whether you can tie them in with other phenomena such as paranormal phenomena or cryptozoology, for instance, cryptid sightings and that sort of thing. I know that there's a lot of theories that there are, they do cross over to a certain degree. They're the big questions. Are there little green men in flying saucers? I suspect that some of the sightings are probably something along those lines. Are we being visited by being some other planets? Probably yes. But to what extent and for how long this has been going on for, I don't know. I just think there are some cases that are too convincing, to be otherwise, to be honest.
Do you take the position that it might be from other planets, or are we talking interdimensional?
I think I'm starting to lean towards the interdimensional argument the more I talk to other people, and the more I talk to people on my podcast, because I just think the distances that are involved, if you're traveling just from our star system to the nearest star system, which is 4.5 light years away, is it Alpha Centauri, something like that, the nearest star? That as a distance is just huge anyway. And then when you start to look at just how big the galaxy is and how many potential stars there are in the galaxy, you're talking billions. And then you're talking about the number of potential galaxies that could run to billions.
Yeah.
The distances involved. What sort of technology he's going to be able to cross such huge distances without there being some sort of, I mean, I'm no physicist, but without some sort of time dilation or something like that, just really because of the vast distances involved. Unless it's a race who are, coming from a star system that are literally next door to us in cosmic terms, you have to start wondering whether these things are coming through from other dimensions. And certainly, I mean, I've spoken to people, for instance, about time slips, where you've basically got a slip in time. It's opening a window into a different time. And to me, there doesn't seem to be much difference between that sort of phenomena and opening up a window from a different dimension. It's the same sort of thing to me. And so it would seem, I think, more likely that these things are coming through from another dimension rather than traveling huge distances, across, to quote Doctor Who, across time and space, because that's basically what they're doing. Now, unless they have some sort of technology that can manipulate space,
If you think about the idea in spiritualism, in seances, they have reports, and I've seen some of these objects, but I can't absolutely 100% say for certain that these objects are what they claim to be. But we'll go along with that proviso for the sake of the argument. But they claim in certain seances to have these things called apports, which are objects that normally will drop out of the ceiling in a seance room onto the table or on the floor, and they materialize by the spirits, allegedly. And they could be old coins, newspapers, flower petals. I did meet some people that had been to a seance at the time, like the week before, where they said a glass of wine had materialized in the seance room, and they were sending it off for analysis. And it didn't disappear after the seance; it actually stayed there permanently. Yeah. And there's a place in Oxfordshire where I've been to a couple of seances, and they've got various objects there that they say is apports and things. So if the spirits, our spirits, our deceased friends, if you like, on the other side, have got some knowledge of moving things through time and space, as you say, from one location of Earth into another, literally through the energy of a seance room or something, then maybe these other ultra-terrestrials, I think they've been referred to by John Keane and people like him, rather than extraterrestrials, are moving in similar ways, using similar kind of forces, perhaps, to bring themselves here, except they might sort of encase themselves in these metal machines for their protection, because, when these apports come through, apparently they're really hot to touch or something. So maybe these beings are, apporting into our time and space dimensions, and the machines, the UFOs, the sources, if you like, are there to protect them from the heat buildup or something, like the re-entry point through our coordinates or something,
Yeah, that's really interesting, because one of the stories that I got involved in, and this is in the first book that I wrote. It's with regards to ghost activity, poltergeist activity, but it's the same sort of thing. There was an instance where an old Victorian penny appeared from just out of thin air and fell to the ground, fell to the floor, in front of this particular gentleman who was telling me about the story. And he said when he tried to pick it up, it was absolutely red hot. He couldn't pick it up. He couldn't touch it. It was too hot, and he just had to wait and leave it for a few minutes for it to cool down before he could pick up and look at it. And when he turned it over and looked at it, he realised it was, for the date on the penny and size of it, and what it was made of. It was obviously an old Victorian, old Victorian penny, as he described it. But it was exactly the same. It was too hot to touch, and it just literally fell out of thin air. So that's quite interesting. Yeah.
Another thing, that could be quite interesting is how, although it's a Victorian penny, did it look new or did it look old? So it's a case of was it picked up from the Victorian era and transported here, or was it picked up from a here and now museum and then transported somewhere else?
Well, he described it as old, so he must have looked at it and perceived it as being old. So, not transported through time as such,
But through space.
Yeah.
or through space, yeah.
It makes you wonder about the newspapers, because, I mean, if they're going to get really hot as well, you think they kind of come out a little bit burnt, and flower petals as well, and that glass of wine might be a bit bubbly by the time that they go to sip it. So, yeah, I mean, there seems to be different methods. I mean, I knew a guy years ago who told me, I mean, we're going back off the UFO subject, slightly back into the haunted houses thing, but it all kind of, I think one encapsulates the other a little bit. But this friend of mine, who's passed on himself now, I might add, he said that he lived in London, and as a sort of a 15-year-old boy, he played with a mate who was in their house, and there was one particular room they were told not to go in it. They couldn't play in there. There was no furniture in there, nothing. They were just told not to play in there. But, of course, him and his friend decided to play in there, and they had a tennis ball, and they were bouncing it off the floor because there was no carpet. It was great to bounce this tennis ball off the floor. They hit it, and it bounced upwards and just disappeared up to the ceiling. And you're thinking, okay, where's it gone? And then they're thinking, where's this tennis ball gone? And 5 minutes later, it dropped out of the ceiling and bounced on the floor. And they picked it up, and it wasn't hot, but he said it was soaking wet. Soaking wet, really mysteriously soaking wet. And I think they said it to someone, and they were banned from that room. And I might be wrong, but I think someone put a cross on the door, but I could be wrong about that. So, yeah, particular room was almost had like seance-like abilities, this particular room. So it seems to be there's hot structures in houses where they're particularly conducive for this phenomena. So the box-like structure in the Conservative Club, maybe the serving hatch was conducive for that phenomenon to manifest through that portal, the man with the hat on, and this room in this house in London. And now people talk about earth energies and ley lines crossing and things like that. And it makes me wonder, maybe a Conservative Club and other houses could have been ley line area. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned ley lines, because, again, this is something that I've looked into. Now, interestingly, there's a major ley line which runs through the town of Accrington. It's actually built on one of the major ley lines. But I was looking at some various different maps of people who had done research over the years into ley lines, and quite a few all pointed to the same thing, which was where I am here. There are 2 major ley lines which cross at Pendle Hill. So there's one which runs north to south, and that runs from Castlerig Stone Circle in the Lake District, and it runs all the way down south to Beachy Head, I believe. And the other one runs from west to east, or east to west, depending on which way you're looking at it, from the Fylde Coast, which is Preston, Blackpool, that sort of area, where, again, there's an awful lot of paranormal activity, and there's some quite interesting activity up on Morecambe Bay as well, which relates to triangular UFOs, which has been going on for well over 100 years, there's reports going back to the late 1800s, 1890s, where they were seeing strange triangular objects in the sky. And this was, of course, before manned flight. So, these were quite strange things for people to see. And they were obviously documented, and documented in the local papers at the time.
I wonder what they documented them as, because we would know them as UFOs or some kind of flying vehicle. I wonder what they would think they were.
They just described them as strange triangular objects in the sky. They didn't have any concept of manned flight or anything like that. But yeah, and then this particular ley line, as I say, it crosses the north-south one here at Pendle Hill, and then it continues across the North Yorkshire moors and intersects the coast up on the northeast. around the Whitby area, which is not a million miles away from where a certain Mr. Paul Sinclair lives, and has some quite strange encounters over the years. So that area obviously is quite heavily influenced, I think, by, and I've spoken to him about this on more than one occasion, and he's of the same opinion that it's definitely got something to do with it. So yeah, ley lines are interesting. I think there's a lot of geology, a lot of geological factors involved that tend to draw in these. There are certain hotspots, I think, of both paranormal and UFO activity, and they tend to run along these ley lines. They tend to be in areas of particular geological features, whether or not there's some sort of natural magnetic fields being generated. So, I mean, for instance, Pendle Hill. Again, I'll talk about something that's local that I know about. The reason why it's there is because it's a different type of stone to the stone around it. So it's basically sandstone, which is sat on limestone. Now, I'm no geologist, but is there some sort of interaction? Is there some sort of natural phenomena going on, which is drawing energy in? Which means that we get a lot of UFO sightings in this area. We get a lot of paranormal activity in this area. And again, I've spoken to quite a few different researchers in both the UFO field and the paranormal field and the cryptozoology field as well, who have all come to the same sort of conclusion that a lot of these hotspots, there is some sort of energy there which is drawing these phenomena in, but we don't quite understand exactly what this energy is and what's causing it.
So it could be like the ley lines are creating where they cross over, maybe kind of portals or something.
Absolutely. Mm. And if you look at the ley lines, and you look to see what features or have been built on them over the years, or where they intersect, or where they cross. A lot of them tend to be on ancient burial sites. I mean, there's a Neolithic burial site right on the top of Pendle Hill, and you're talking 2,000 feet above sea level. So, why somebody would go to the trouble of taking a body all the way up. I mean, I've walked up the side of Pendle Hill. I know how steep it is. Why you would want to take a body all the way up there to bury it on the top of a hill when you could bury it down in the valley below, and it would be a lot easier to do. There's a lot of these questions as to why our ancestors built these burial sites or built these stone circles, and a lot of them tend to be built on what we would now identify as ley lines.
Now, it's interesting, you've got to take into the account of also the movement of the Earth through the solar system as well. And I think that might have something to do with it, because where we're moving through the galactic coordinates of moving around, because our whole galaxy is turning as well. So we're continually moving. Earth is spinning, and it's also moving around the sun. The sun is moving through with all the spiral galaxy. And I'm thinking that's possibly a factor in all this as well. The fact that we're moving does, for instance, UFOs or hauntings. I mean, I was thinking about the idea that ghosts will come out in Halloween, or Hallows Eve, if you like, around October, where they say the veil of the world's the thinnest, October the 31st or something. And I'm thinking, now, why has that date been set? Could it be that the Earth has moved into a certain position around the solar system or around the sun, that particular point has been found to be conducive much more to psychic phenomena or sightings or something, because all our planets or something, and we're leaning into astrology here, maybe a little bit, that we're in the right star position or something. Could the energies have some sort of strange flux pattern that causes these manifestations to occur at more frequency than others? I mean, for instance, people that work on ham radios will find that if they start to do their communications in the evening, it's because they can send their signals a lot further, because they've got the skip in the atmosphere. The signals bounce a lot off the atmosphere a lot further in the evening times, whereas in the day it's it's a different kind of thing that you're talking about. So that's an example how communication would work. That it seems to be better in the evenings, and they're also talking about ghosts come out at night a lot more. Is there something to do with the evening or the nighttime side of things, where this phenomena is much more active or able to manifest? And again, if we go into the physical seance idea, that spirits tend to occur in seances when they draw the curtains and they block the daylight out, or they'll have a seance at night because physical light is damaging to the medium and the phenomena, because it's like exposing old film, if you like, if you're in a developing room, to daylight, it destroys the film. And it has the same effect on the physical manifesting spirits. So I'm wondering perhaps that, the point of the planet in the solar system, or where it is around the sun at a certain time of year, might have a factor in so many UFOs appearing, like in a month of May or something like that. I don't know. I mean, has anyone come up with any research you're aware of that might pinpoint certain factors?
No, not that I'm aware of in that respect, but certainly when, you mentioned about the night time. I mean, obviously our natural senses, excuse me, are more highlighted, I think, at night because it's dark. We have to rely on other senses rather than just eyesight. When we're out and about and it's dark, if you're in a particularly dark area. And I think from an evolutionary point of view, I think we've always, we've evolved to have more of a heightened awareness around us at night, because that's when we probably face the most danger. So I think it may well be that we're able to pick things up more when it's nighttime, simply because we're more aware of what's going on around us. And during the day, we don't have to be quite as aware in the same sort of way. But I certainly think that, there are theories about ghosts, again, coming through from other dimensions. So a ghost may not necessarily be what stays behind when somebody dies, the energy that stays behind when somebody dies. It's more an energy that's coming through from another dimension or from another time, like a time slip, but it's not fully manifesting itself, it's not fully forming, so that you see that person fully formed as, I'm looking at you now and you're looking at me. Because it's not coming through fully, you're only seeing part of it. So you're seeing, your classic sort of ghost that is sort of semi-translucent that you can see through. You can see what's going on behind it, and it's that filmy sort of shape. That is, part of the energy of whatever this being is, coming through from its plane of existence into ours, but only coming through, 20% of it's coming through. So you're only seeing a little bit of its true form. So I think that's an interesting theory. Another theory that I have is that actually when you see a ghost, it is somebody who is dreaming. So it's actually, when you're dreaming, when you have a very vivid dream and you're interacting with somebody in your dream, you are actually interacting with somebody as a ghost. Now, I think that's a really interesting theory, and it's one that somebody mentioned to me off recording when I was doing an episode of the podcast. And I've since gone away and done a bit of research and tried to find any research that's been done into this idea that when you dream, it's actually your physical, it's your soul that is moving out of your body and going off somewhere else,
astral traveling or something,
manifesting as an entity to people who are awake. And I think that I find that really, really interesting.
Well, there's a story,
a little bit perplexing as well, a little bit worried.
Yeah. There is a story that was related to me by an ex-work colleague of mine a couple of years back. I hadn't seen her for donkey's years, and basically she heard that I did video and edited and stuff, and she wondered if I'd film her 70th birthday party. So she got back in contact with me, and I sort of basically said, yeah, sure. So went round to her place to discuss the details of where it all was and, put together a plan, basically. And we started talking about ghosts or something for some reason. I can't remember why. And she said, oh, I've seen a ghost. And I said, have you? And she goes, I said, tell me what you saw. And she said, well, she was about 18 at the time. She'd gone on holiday, I think, to Devon with her family. And she stayed in this particular small room in this cottage. And it had a tiny little window at the end where she could see the sea just outside the window. And she said she woke up in the night and she saw this old woman sitting in the chair right next to the bed. But she said the old woman appeared to be asleep, like that. And she also said that she thought the woman looked remarkably like her grandmother, which was a bit strange, she thought. Anyway, she got quite frightened of it, obviously, because she could see this ghostly woman sitting in the chair next to her bed. So she put her head under the covers and turned over, and then eventually she fell asleep. Anyway, she woke up a few hours later, and she said she could see out the window. It was just getting light now, and she could see the sea a bit clearer through this window. And then she remembered about this ghostly woman. And so she tentatively peered over the blankets and looked across to see where she had seen her, and she was still bloody there, this woman, still there. And she said this time her head was back like that, like looking upwards, but still asleep. And she said as she watched her, she slowly kind of just dissolved into nothingness in front of her. And she told her family the next day, and they were all a bit sort of freaked out by it, I suppose. And, she said that it did look like her grandmother, though, and she was a bit confused by this. So I kind of thought about this, and I thought, well, maybe the grandmother, like you say, was dreaming of the family, or maybe subconsciously concerned about her family because they'd gone away on holiday and she was wondering how they would get her on, or maybe concerned that they're okay. This is the days before we had mobile phones and things, And so she probably wouldn't hear anything from them for a few days until maybe she got a postcard through, And so I wondered if the grandmother had gone to sleep, maybe dreamt of the family, worried about them, whatever, but gone out of her body, gone to her granddaughter, Joan, in this case, and ended up sitting in the chair next to her, but she was still asleep in her mind. And so the spectre of this astral self was still asleep, but she stayed like a guardian, perhaps, like right next to her the whole night. And it's only as the daylight came where maybe these things, the light is not conducive for these manifestations, or I don't know, but she started to dissolve, and maybe because it was becoming daylight, the physical granny, if you like, was starting to perhaps wake up herself.
Yeah.
And so that part had to go back to the body.
And was it the case that this lady was still alive when they checked afterwards?
Yeah, she was still alive. I mean, she hadn't said, she died while she was on holiday, but she said, her granny was alive and well, and she just remarked that this spectre looked like her granny. Now, there's another story I can tell you, which again supports this idea a little bit. Now, it concerns my mum. I've said this a few times here on the Paranormal Peep Show, but for people that haven't heard this before, it's quite an interesting story. Concerns my mum and my brother. Now, my mum passed away suddenly in 2016. I was there at the house at the time, and I was actually editing a video in the spare bedroom. And so it was an unexpected death. She died suddenly. And anyway, so obviously, we had a funeral and everything like that. And it was only when me and my brother got talking, maybe a few weeks later, that he said that he had been staying at the house maybe 3 weeks before my mum had actually died, and he was sleeping in the spare bedroom. And he said that he suddenly woke up and saw my mum as a young girl, maybe in her 20s or 30s, coming through the wall, skipping, holding her dress out. And he said it was like a silent movie, and she was smiling, skipping, and she came through the bedroom, and she just vanished through the window, basically. And he thought, what the bloody hell's going on this? Because my brother's quite psychic. He does see things. And he just sort of thought, what the bloody hell's that? And he kind of thought, well, that was Mum, but as she was all those years ago. What's going on? I don't recall him ever saying that he actually said anything to her, but I wondered in hindsight whether my mum was testing out her wings, so to speak, before she then made her final journey to the spirit world some 3 weeks later, and this was like practicing her out-of-body experiences. Maybe it's a sign from my brother as well to say, it's going to happen soon. This is a sign or something like that. I don't know. But again, she was still alive and well at that point, and yet she was cited as a spectre. And I do know that there is the Society of Psychical Research has a number of accounts of people that have cited spectres or ghosts or whatever you want to call them of the living.
Yeah,
and yet, they're thousands of miles away, and yet they've seen a ghost of so-and-so in their living room or something.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So yeah, it's a rather interesting theory, I think.
Yeah. So with that, I suppose you could account for many more ghost sightings than we put down just as being dead people, but in fact very much alive people. Now, I heard on a podcast recently, some people were discussing the American Civil War, and this medium apparently somehow managed to, she saw a ghost or a spirit of someone from the Civil War times in America, a soldier in the Civil War, and somehow she managed to communicate with him, I understand. But the Civil War ghost or spirit said to them that he could see the medium, but to him, she looked like the ghost, which is the weird thing.
Yeah.
So it's almost like either they're two time zones that are appearing at each other through some hole in reality or something, or visual reality.
Yeah.
Or the ghost is stuck on his plane or something and he can't quite understand where he is. I don't know. There's lots of theories to that, but I kind of like the idea of simultaneous time and everything occurring at once as well.
Yeah.
There's the famous Roman ghosts of York as well, which comes to mind on that one, because that was done by the plumber guy, Harry Martindale, who was an apprentice plumber. And as he was working on these pipes and things in the basement cellar of this house in York, he heard a horn blowing and he couldn't work out where the horn noise was coming from. And eventually it got louder and louder and louder. And he looked below him because he was up a ladder and he saw these Romans marching through the wall. And he fell off the ladder and scurried into the corner of the cellar where he was. And he said these Romans appeared to be muddied faces, the growths on, like they're growing beards and things like that. And they took no notice of him. They didn't even acknowledge him, but they seemed to be speaking in a language that he didn't understand. He could actually hear them as well. But these ghosts were sighted some years later, and they appeared to be the same ghosts, but they were doing slightly different actions. This time they were all asleep on horses, and the horses were marching them back to presumably the base where they go, the fort or something, the Roman fort. But they're all so tired, they're all asleep on their horses, and the horses are just taking them back, and that's how they were sighted by a different person. But again, they were covered in mud. And I wondered if, in fact, that they're peering through time because they're not seeing a recording like the stone tape recording.
Yeah.
Talk about, don't they? Where it's just a recording being replayed and replayed and replayed. But in this case, they were doing different actions. So the lady was seeing a different episode, but maybe the same characters, or even a different set of Romans, maybe from a few years later.
So it's sort of like a time slip or something like that.
Yeah, like a time slip. Because interestingly, Harry Martindale was working in the cellar in the cold November months. And so you think that if those Romans were covered in mud, it suggests that they were in their month of maybe November, or in a winter time at least, to be having mud on the ground, maybe the rain and stuff like that. And again, they were covered in mud when these ghosts were sighted 7 years later, in the January, I think in 1957, by the housekeeper on this occasion. But again, they were covered in mud, but asleep on their horses. So it's each time that they were sighted in their winter time, from the corresponding winter time of the 1950s, when these two different people, Harry Martindale and the housekeeper, had seen these spirits or ghosts. So I think that there are literally holes through time or something, and they're peering to a simultaneous broadcast from Roman times. The Romans may even see people from our future. I mean, it could be that when we're seeing these UFOs, they could be visitors from our future that are peering from their point of view in time back to us or something.
Yeah, it's a definite possibility that we're seeing forward into time, and they're seeing backward into time.
Another factor, of course, is whether the ghosts, it's quite a broad term, ghost, whether they're consciously aware of the person that's viewing them, or whether they're in their own little world, which would kind of maybe kind of signify that they might be kind of like a playback, the stone tape theory, like a literally not really a conscious thing, but you're viewing a video. But when they're kind of like looking back at you and make a conscious effort to kind of communicate, then we might be talking about something different. So the category of ghost can kind of split, can't it, into two?
Yeah. I mean, I've come across stories of all the different types of ghosts that I'm aware of. So I've come across stories of replays, so the stone tape theory, particularly interesting one that's in the first book of a school in Tegel, Darwin, which is close to Blackburn. And this was very much attached to the place rather than the building. So it was what had been there before that was influencing this loop, basically, of this woman that was being seen. And there was no interaction whatsoever, and it was just literally a loop that was being seen over and over and over again in this same place. And then, of course, there's the poltergeist phenomena, which my wife's family, they as I said earlier on, they lived in a farmhouse. They had a poltergeist, or certainly a ghost who was very much aware of what, and I'm pretty sure it was a he, of what he was doing, because he was interacting, and he was reacting to them as well, which was quite interesting. So not only was he moving things around, and he levitated a glass that was half full of whiskey that had just been poured on the sideboard. He actually levitated that across the room in front of my wife's grandparents who were staying at the farm at the time. But he would react to my sister-in-law, so my wife's younger sister, because he always used to, they used to hear him moving about at night, banging and stomping his feet around at night in the hallway upstairs. And he would always stop outside my sister-in-law's bedroom and bang on the door. And she would shout to him to go away in not so many and he would go away and stop. So he was very much acting and reacting in a different way to just a sort of replay, and again, I spoke to people who there are other stories in the book as well. I mean, there's one, a very interesting one, of a lady who moved into a house with her daughter, her very young daughter, who said that she used to play with a little boy, but this little boy had no legs. And when she finally saw this little boy, because her daughter had been talking about him for a couple of years, and she'd heard him, she'd never seen him, but when she finally saw him, it was almost as if he was stood in the room, but the floor level had changed over the years, so he was stood on a lower floor level, as therefore they could only see the top half of his legs from his sort of knees upwards, in effect. And that's why her daughter thought that he didn't have any legs. So that's interesting. And she said that he used to react again. They could hear him whistling and singing and all sorts of stuff. So that again, I think, is a very interesting type of haunting as well.
Do you have any accounts of modern ghosts, like people that have died, say, in the last 20 or 30 years, where people have been seen?
No, I haven't, to be quite honest with you. No, I can't think of one off the top of my head. A lot of them do tend to be sightings of ghosts that are obviously from quite a while ago, because of the way that they're dressed.
Yeah.
So, for instance, there's an account of again, this was at the school. There are a number of ghosts in that area, and then one of them was a little boy who used to see him. Well, they used to hear him, but they also used to see him running around in the school but he was quite clearly dressed in what they used to describe as Victorian rags. So, you know, from that sort of period, but very dirty, ragged clothes, you know. And, you know, sort of sightings, stories that I've picked up from the area that I live in now around here. Again, they tend to be ghosts that are dressed in older clothes, not modern clothes. I can't really think, unfortunately, of any stories that I've heard.
I heard one a couple of years ago. This hairdresser girl came to the house here where my girlfriend lives, and I literally was about to start writing my book, and I was obviously fishing for ghost stories, and I thought, oh, hairdressers, they get to chat to lots of people. I bet they pick up a few tales here and there. And this hairdresser girl, I said, oh, has anyone ever mentioned ghosts to you? And, you know, like you've cut their hair and they're telling you ghost stories. And she goes, well, I've seen one actually. I said, oh, really? She goes, yeah, I was living in this house down this particular road here in Weymouth on the southwest coast. And she said she was laying on the bed with her daughter, like putting her daughter to bed or something. And she said she suddenly saw rising up out of the floor right next to the bed, literally coming out of the floor, this guy who had like a bit of a moustache on him. And he appeared to be wearing like a T-shirt and something like a modern day hoodie. And he appeared to be sort of coming out of the floor. And I don't know if he was looking at me, he sort of went up and sort of backwards, floated backwards. And she just shit a brick, basically. She grabbed her child, ran to the end of the bed, literally jumped off the bed, ran out the room. She phoned her dad saying, you got to come and effing get me now, because we'd just seen this ghost or something in the house. And she said that he looked like a young man, maybe in his early 30s, and she had heard that someone had died in the house of a drug overdose in the previous years. Yeah. So we kind of wondered whether maybe that was something to do with him. But he was a modern day spirit, like in modern day clothes. He had died literally maybe within the last 10 years or something, you know, according to what she described, the hoodies, the T-shirt, you know, it was in the bedroom, and presumably that he had died where she had seen him. So maybe he had become trapped, or that was his energy. I don't know. But it was at that point where they were starting to relax and, you know, fall into a gentle slumber that this presence became known to them or something. I don't think she lives there now, so I don't think she'd probably want to go back there. But yeah, there must be more. I mean, more.
There must be. Yeah.
You know, we're creating ghosts all the time. We've got to be.
Well, this is it. Yeah, it's like an infinite process.
Yeah, it is. And I wonder whether one of the reasons why we don't see modern ghosts, if you like, so people who have just passed recently and are dressed in that sort of attire is because maybe the longer they're here, the stronger the energy becomes, and so we see them more because they've been here longer. It's sort of like a cumulative effect of the energy that they need to be able to project themselves. Doesn't sort of become mature, if you like, until they've been dead for a while. Again, it's a bit of a strange theory, but it could explain why we don't see many modern dressed ghosts. They all tend to be, dressed in older period clothing for some reason.
I'm gonna throw a spanner in the works, I think, when I die. If I know when I'm gonna die, you know, I've been given some terminal illness in a day, I'm gonna make sure that when I'm in the hospice or wherever, I'm gonna dress up in medieval clothes. So that when I die and I'll be seen walking the grounds, it'll completely screw up their theory about it, because he was born into the piece wearing medieval clothes. Oh my God, that doesn't sort of tally up. They're building these reenactment people, you know, that probably die on their pretend battlefields as well. Because I mean, this is the thing, you know, that humanity has been around for so long now that we must have bucket loads of ghosts kicking about. You know, every century, every year must be producing that, and it's like a natural phenomenon. Whatever this thing of ghosts is, it seems to be a mixture of different things. You know, one kind of thing doesn't fit all the descriptions or the things. Some seem to be time slips. Some appear to be repeat actions in time, like a recording, if you like. Others seem to be direct communications with spirits that are trapped here on the earth, So they all seem to have different kind of mechanisms, if you like, to produce very similar phenomena. But we kind of tar them all with the same brush, but I think they're actually quite different phenomena. So have you seen ghosts yourself, Craig? You've obviously had people in your family experience these things. Have you actually seen any ghosts yourself?
Well, apart from the Shadow Man, I have seen what you would call poltergeist activity. I've been in the vicinity of poltergeist activity happening. One really interesting thing actually has been going on, and this is a story that's evolving all the time, and it's one that I've mentioned over the last few guest spots that I've had on various different people's podcasts. So it's sort of moved along a little bit. If anybody's listened to any of the other interviews, it seems to be moving along. For those that have heard the story, they'll remember that I mentioned that about 10 years ago we bought a piano. But it was a bit more than that. It was about 12 years ago now. And it was because of my wife's from a very musical family. She is very musical herself. She plays the piano, she plays the cello, she sings. Her parents were were both professional musicians. So she comes from a very musical background. And we bought this piano. It wasn't particularly expensive, we're not talking an awful lot of money. It was a second-hand piano. We bought it from a piano shop, actually. There's a shop in Clitheroe that sells pianos. And I went back to talk to the guy about this piano a few years after we'd got it, and then you'll understand why when I tell you the story. I did quite a bit of research on it when we first bought it, and we had it professionally tuned. And the guy that came around to tune it, when he opened the top, it's an upright piano. It's not a grand piano or anything like that. But it was built made in 1908 in Leipzig, in Germany, by a company called Bluthner. Now, I contacted Bluthner, and they gave me a history of who they sold it to, the retailer that they sold it to in Manchester in 1911, and then who it was sold to, who bought it from there. And it turned out it had been in the same family for an awful long time, from when it was bought back in the pre-war up until the point where this shop that we bought it from, he bought it in a house clearance, so it had been in the same family for that whole period. We started to have some quite bad luck when we bought this piano. My wife had some problems with a job. We just went through a really difficult period, and I started to think that there was something to do with this piano. I always felt that there was something attached to this piano, and as we know, you can have various types of spirits or entities attached to objects, and the classic ones are haunted dolls. People think the dolls specifically because of, obviously, they look human. But I know of stories of spirits being attached to other objects. And as I say, in this particular case, I felt that there was something attached to this piano. Piano's in the dining room, which is a room that we don't go in very often, but it's always freezing cold in there, even in the middle of summer. And this isn't something that we used to experience before we got the piano. So there's definitely something which is coming from it. Now, we both myself and my wife started to experience really strange things, like sort of smells, for instance, really strange smells. The smell that I used to get was really heavy perfume. But the only way that I can describe it is It's like the sort of stuff that your granny would have worn. So, that really heavy floral, overpowering perfume that old ladies tend to wear.
Yeah.
I started smelling that randomly around the house, which was quite strange because, again, before we got the piano, we never had that at all. We started seeing shadows. We both started seeing shadows in especially in the lounge. We would see out the corner of our eye these shadows moving about. There'd be noises, there'd be doors opening and closing, you sort of classic sort of haunting type stuff. And then
did you find out if there was a lady connected to the piano or who it might have been?
I found out from the manufacturer that it had been who it had been sold to, but they only gave me they said it was a family who lived in Haslingden. Haslingden is a town on the north side of, well, it's north of Manchester basically, but it's heading towards Manchester from where I live. It's in the Rosendale Valley, which strangely enough has got a lot of UFO activity in it, but that's a different story. But no, they only said that it had been sold to a family in Haslingden, and they knew that it had stayed in this family because they had serviced it. They'd gone out and tuned it up. They had their own tuners from that particular company, because they had an office. They have an office in London, because I contacted them in London, gave them the serial number of the piano and everything else. So although they didn't give me, they didn't, for instance, say yes, it was sold to a lady, or yes, it was sold to a gentleman, called Mr. Smith or Mrs. Smith or whatever. They said it had been in the same family for all that time, for about 80 years. So it had obviously been passed down through the family. So the weirdest thing that happened about 12 months ago. And this was during the daytime. It wasn't anything that happened at night or anything like that. And we have two doors. We have an outer door and an inner door, so it's like a vestibule. We call it. Sort of like, it's a space of about 3 foot square, basically 3 foot by 3 foot, with an inner door, and then we've got the outer door. And the outer door has obviously got a letterbox in it. And this particular occasion, there was a piece of junk mail that had been shoved through the letterbox, and it was half in, half out. And the letterbox itself is on quite a stiff spring, so in order to be able to push something through or pull something through, you have to do it by force. Because if there's a letter, my postman just shoves the letter through, and most of the time it gets stuck halfway because the spring is that tight on it. So you have to physically pull it through from the side. Now, there was a piece of junk mail, as I say, in the letterbox, and we have a couple of dogs, and I was putting the harnesses on them, getting ready to take them out for a walk. And I was in this vestibule, and I had the dogs with me, and I was doing what I was doing. And all of a sudden, this piece of junk mail, literally, it was like an invisible hand grabbed it and pulled it, and it came right across in front of my face and dropped to the floor. Now, I know there was nobody outside pushing it through, because 2 reasons. One, I could see through the glass. There was nobody there. Secondly, I've got a video doorbell, and I actually went back and looked on the video doorbell recording, and there was nothing there. I just know that something had to physically have grabbed it and pulled it through the letterbox, because there was no physical explanation as to how it could have done it itself. It's as simple as that. And strangely enough, the dogs didn't react at that point. They have reacted to other things, and they've done the usual sitting there looking up at the ceiling and watching something go from one side of the room to the other, which is quite unnerving. But in this point, and mainly because I was so excited because I was getting the leads out for them, and they were making it notice. Said, "Oh no, Cocker Spaniels, so they're very excited anyway, very excitable dogs anyway." But they didn't react, and to be honest with you, I didn't really think. I know it sounds daft, but I actually didn't think anything of it until I'd been out with the dogs, and then I came back, and it was still on the mat. I just left it there, and I thought, hang on a minute, how did that happen? This process now, what's going on? How's it happened? And the only way that it could have possibly happened was that some force, like an unseen hand, had grabbed hold of it and pulled it. And I remember hearing the snap of the letterbox, the metal brass letterbox, the spring going like that as it was pulled through. So, that was very odd. And I can only attribute it to the same things that have been going on around the house. And since then, I've still had the same seeing shadows. And in fact, one Friday evening, I was sat in the lounge on my own, with the door into the lounge would be to my left, and it was open slightly, probably about, I don't know, maybe about 2 feet, something like that, just so the dogs could go in and out. And I remember sitting there, and I was watching the TV, and out of the corner of my eye, I could see these. The only way I can describe them, they were children-sized shadows that were moving towards me, and then when they sort of got into my main field of view, disappeared. But these shadows that we see around the house, and especially in the lounge, they're like that. You sort of see them out of the corner of your eye, and when you try and get them into full view, they disappear. It's like they're always there, just in the periphery. Now, that freaked me out a little bit more than everything else that's happened.
I bet.
Because they were small objects.
Could they be greys rather than children?
Could be, couldn't it?
Yeah, very possible.
You never know.
Yeah, and I've had some very interesting conversations about greys with, with people like Ronald and Philip.
Oh, Philip, yeah, they're the experts on that. We're coming to the end now. It's really raced through, actually, of the Paranormal Peep Show. So thank you, Craig, for joining us. When can people find out about your podcast? When does it go out on the Paranormal UK Radio Network?
Normally goes out, if I get them out on time, and I'm always getting told off by Mark for not putting them out on time. They usually go out on a Thursday.
Yeah.
They usually go out every 2 to 3 weeks.
Yep.
You can also listen to them on most other podcast
catch-up services and things like that.
Yeah. Sort of thing, yeah. So, and I'm also, I've got a website, which is craigbryant.co.uk. There's details of the book on there. There's links to the podcast. I'm also on Facebook as well, so Paranormal Pendle, and I normally put a post on there with a link to a new show. So when they do go up, usually with an apology for being late, you can usually follow the link on there as well.
Cool. Any plans for another book in the pipeline?
Yeah, I'm doing some research at the moment into hauntings around water.
Interesting. Oh, cool. Well, when's that due out? Maybe later in the year, or
probably next year.
Next year, yeah.
So yeah.
It's a lot of material to collate and get together and organise.
Well, I've already got quite a few stories anyway that I've been collating, and I've got some personal things linked to the Leeds Liverpool Canal. So I'm doing some research into the Leeds Liverpool Canal, the history of that, and there's quite a lot of paranormal activity attached to that as well, which is interesting. So,
wow, a lot. I mean, there's a never-ending supply of paranormal stories. When you start digging these things, there's always something that's going to turn up. Well, thank you very, very much indeed to Craig Bryant of the Paranormal Pendle Podcast. So stay tuned for that if you're interested in finding out more about Craig's interviews and his books and things. We will be back next month, Andy and I, hopefully on the Paranormal Peep Show. We're usually around on the third Thursday of every month on the Paranormal Peep Show, so stay tuned for that. And also listen out to all the other brilliant shows on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. There's a whole gamut of different shows of different subjects and things like that. If this is the first time you've heard us, check out the Paranormal UK Radio website at pauk.co.uk, I think it is, or .com, I can't remember now, but I'm sure you'll be able to find it. So thanks very much for myself, Neil Geddes-Ward, and Andy.
Just want to say, if anyone's got any ghost stories or anything, then do give us an email or contact us. always look on the lookout for new people.
We do have a Facebook group. Andy's running that as well. So find us on Facebook, and you can always message Andy through that. And I'm sure that we'll be pleased to hear from you if you've got anything you want to tell us, or you will have comments to talk about the show. Put them in the YouTube comments. We'll be interested to see what you have to say. Thanks very much indeed, one and all, for joining us, especially to Craig. And thank you very much indeed to you listening to us. We appreciate it. Good night.
Take care.
You're listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network, voted #1 for paranormal podcasts in the UK.